And can he provide more detail today? Mr Speaker, finally, this must mark the start of a more strategic approach to China, based on an ethical approach to foreign policy and an end to the naivety of the golden era years. And if it does, he can be assured that he will have our full support on this side of the House. Like him, our quarrel is not with the people of China, but the erosion of freedoms in Hong Kong, the actions of the Chinese government in the South China Sea, and the appalling treatment of the Uyghur people is reason now to act. We will not be able to say in future years that we did not know, and I urge him to work with colleagues across government to ensure that this marks the start of a strategic approach to China and the start of a new era. Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her response, and in particular her support for the two measures we're taking today, suspending the extradition treaty arrangements and extending the arms embargo. I might note that there's a drastically different tone being taken from the front bench from even a few weeks ago, but we welcome her support, and we'll do so in a spirit of cross-party endeavour and the importance of sending a very clear signal to Beijing and indeed to our international partners where we stand. She asked about the review of policing. Of course, she's right about that. It's a question of balance. We'll keep that under constant review. She mentioned a range of points about B&O, the details on it. They will be set forward by the Home Secretary shortly in the way I described. I would urge her to wait for the detail before critiquing it. The Home Secretary and the Home Office have been doing a huge amount of work since September last year on all of this. And of course, we also need to bear in mind the other offers that other countries quite rightly and usefully will be making. On international coordination, I welcome what she said. She's right about the importance of working with my German opposite number. I'm seeing him this week. It's something which is squarely on the agenda. We've also already, obviously through the Five Eyes membership, touched base with a number of our Commonwealth colleagues, but I'll continue to do that. I think she's right about this point. It needs to be more than just the Europeans and the UK with the North Americans, the traditional Five Eyes and Europeans, because there's a whole range of non-aligned countries out there who are very much influenced by what China is doing and saying, and we want them to support us in upholding the international rule of law, which in all areas, including, as she mentioned, the South China Sea, will be very important. On investments, we rigorously review not just all investments into this country from the security point of view, but also whether our powers are sufficient. So that is something that we will keep under review, and I know the Secretary of State for Business is looking at very carefully. I think she's right as well about the September LegCo elections. I've made clear that we want to see them allowed to take place in the way that is recognised not just in the joint declaration but also the basic law, and I agree with her on the point about disqualification of candidates. I think we also need to be just realistic, if I'm honest with her, about the likelihood of China or the Hong Kong authorities accepting international observers. She asked about Magnitsky sanctions. It's not the case. She's simply wrong to say that we haven't done our homework on this. We've done our homework since August of last year, which is why we could introduce those sanctions for the situation with Jamal Khashoggi, Sergei Magnitsky and North Korea. And of course the national security legislation, which we're responding to, has only just been enacted, let alone starting to be enforced. So we will patiently gather the evidence. It takes months. It is not, as she's previously suggested, just something that can be done on a political whim. Indeed, it would be improper. It would be improper if that was the case. And of course, if you introduced those targeted sanctions in this field and indeed any other without having done your factual evidential due diligence, not only are they likely to be challenged, but you're at risk of giving a propaganda coup to the very people that we are seeking to target. She mentioned HSBC. She may or may not have already heard the comments I've made about that. I think certainly on our side we will not allow the rights, the autonomy of the people of Hong Kong to be sacrificed on the altar of bankers' bonuses, and we urge all businesses to look very carefully about how they respond. They're of course going to be nervous about any potential retaliatory measures that may be taken by Beijing. In any event, we're very clear on the path that we're taking, and as I said before, we want a good relationship with China. I think it's very important that we have a balanced, open debate about this in the House. We'll recognise the opportunities of a good relationship with China, but be clear-eyed, as this government is, about the risks and what we do to protect against them.
Chair of the Select Committee, John Toogan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I thank again, I'm getting into a bad habit here, may I thank again my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, for an extremely good policy change. This makes the fifth, by my count, that he's backed the Foreign Affairs Committee on, which is the strategic alignment of the departments, BNOs overseas, Magnitsky's protocols generally, and foreign ownership control overseas. Now, this is actually claiming credit slightly for his work, because he was so instrumental in many of these things from his time on the backbenches. But given his time before even entering here as a human rights lawyer, could I just ask why he hasn't yet made an announcement on the abuse of the Uyghur Muslim population in Western China, action that his opposite number in the United States, or rather the US Treasury, has already taken, and which has been campaigned on so forcefully by my honourable friend, the member for Rutland and Melton, and of course my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. Could I also ask what his view is of Article 38 and the extraterritoriality of this jurisdiction, of this security law, and the implications for British and Canadian and Australian and New Zealand judges sitting on the Court of Final Appeal, and whether he's discussed that with his opposite numbers, because of course the application of their law, Chinese law, into a common law jurisdiction could make the position of those judges untenable, and it is really for him to advise them on how to act.
Can I thank my honourable friend, the Chairman of the Select Committee, for his fulsome support and his Select Committee's fulsome support for the action the government has taken. There's plenty of credit to go around, but the reality is we've taken, I think, a proportionate approach, one which recognised the severity of what's happening in Hong Kong, but also, in the way I described, seeks to have a balanced and telegraph a balanced message to the government in Beijing that our relationship is there with goodwill and with respect for international obligations to be a positive one. He asked about Xinjiang. We have made very clear our position. Indeed, we led for the first time in the United Nations Human Rights Council a statement on the situation on human rights in both Hong Kong and Xinjiang. 27 countries in total signed that statement. It's the first time it's been done. He asked also in relation to judges on the Supreme Court in Hong Kong. That's something we obviously keep under careful review, given the need and indeed the commitment in the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law for the autonomy of the judiciary, as well as the autonomy of the legislators to be respected. And so we will discuss that with our international partners. He asked, I think, finally about extraterritoriality. It's not entirely clear, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, quite how that will work in practice, whether it would just apply to Hong Kong residents when they're outside of the country, or whether indeed it is intended to apply to non-Chinese, non-Hong Kong nationals. And that is one of the factors, amongst others, that informed our approach to the suspension of extradition.
We now come to SNP spokesman Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement, and I commend him on the tone and the content of it. He picks up on the change of tone from the opposition benches. There's been something of a change in the government's position as well of late, so I think we should all recognise this is evolving fast. I would associate us with supporting both the measures in the statement. I think it is proportionate and fair. We also want a positive relationship with China. They're a key partner in renewable energy, as he rightly says, but they are making it increasingly difficult with the actions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, with a One Belt, One Road over Hong Kong, the South China Sea, the situation in Taiwan, of course, and Xinjiang. Also, commercial piracy and industrial espionage. There is lots of cause for concern about the actions of the Chinese state. So we do support these measures, but I press him on three further points. Firstly, on the Magnitsky sanctions, I accept fully that this has to be done properly, but it could be done properly faster. And I think there is a need to accelerate, particularly in the case of the Uyghur situation, proportionate sanctions there. And on the suspension of the extradition treaty, this is not something to be celebrated. The breakdown of criminal and judicial cooperation will make the fight against organised crime, which is prevalent in Hong Kong and London, harder. So what comes next? Will it be a case-by-case basis, or are we looking to evolve some sort of new arrangement to deal with that pressing problem? Because it is and will remain a pressing problem. And on students, which is where I think this debate will get to quite quickly, Stirling University, my constituency, and universities up and down the UK and Scotland, welcome thousands of Chinese students, and we value academic freedom, and we're glad to see them here. Precisely that academic freedom that the state of China is looking to take advantage of. Is there guidance which could be provided to universities about the implications of having so many Chinese students in their institution, both from a security and financial perspective? And is there any analysis underway of the Confucius Institutes, which I believe do need a bit more attention than they've had to date?
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman and welcome his support on the two measures that we've announced today. He asked about Magnitsky sanctions, the point I made to the Honourable Lady, and I welcome the fulsome and eager support for the regime that we have just, on this side of the House, introduced, but with cross-party support, which we welcome. I just call for just a note of caution in terms of speed. It's very important that these targeted sanctions are done right, not quick. If you do them too quickly, they'll be legally challenged. Not only will then they be ineffective, but you risk, as I said to the Honourable Lady, giving a propaganda coup to the very individuals whom we are seeking to hold to account. On extradition, the approach that we've taken, and I set it out quite deliberately, was that we are suspending, not just wholesale terminating, we're suspending the extradition treaty arrangements so that it is clear that they could be resuscitated in the future. But as I also made very clear, we would need to have clear, adequate and robust safeguards to protect against the potential abuses that we see in the national security legislation before that could even be contemplated. So I think that is the approach that we would consider. He also, I think, referred to my comment about a different tone on the opposition benches. I hope he doesn't mind me noting that it wasn't that long ago that the Scottish Government's China engagement strategy called for Scotland to be seen as the preferred trade and investment partner in China. I sense that maybe there's a slight nuance in position in 2020.